Good morning, Pa. Well, time to get to chapter 3. All right. Last time we were talking about Satan and his influence, and that was really fascinating. I never thought about how much in the Church of Jesus Christ we have that worldview. But it's funny how culturally in the church there's the two extremes. Those who, he's always after me, and those who are like, well, yeah, he's around, but even though I tend to be, oh yeah, I know he's around. I always think of him more as an internal influence, as if the Holy Ghost were the good influence internally. Satan and his influence would be internally as well, but for temptation, blinding, and pride, etc. I wonder, the thing that I really was musing about is I'm wondering why the scribes took out the descriptions of Satan. Why would they not include him? I can see them trying to take out references to Jesus Christ and divine feminine stuff because they're going hard on the monotheism and especially hard on let's make the law, let's make sure that everyone can be good people and measurably good people by checking off all these marks, right? They wanted to replace your relationship with God and all continual improvement always and helping everyone to continually improve with, as long as you've met these check marks, then you're good. But why would excluding Satan be part of that agenda? The only thing I can think of is that, well, Satan is just so passé. We've grown beyond the idea of monsters coming out to try and get you. The idea is, truly, you just need to keep the law, keep the commandments. There's no boogeyman that's coming out to get you. Seriously, just follow the law. That's the only thing I can think of as an attitude like that they dismiss supernatural influence. They'll be along the lines of, yeah, well, God will help us as long as we're following the law, because he provided the law. But how much less do they really emphasize him in the way that they changed things? Well, God is there. We know it. Why? Because he gave us the law. And because we have the law, then, well, that's all we really need. We don't have to keep listening to him. He doesn't have to appear to us again. It's just interesting that it's both the apostasy before Jesus Christ, when Jesus Christ was restoring his church and his gospel, and then the second restoration after Jesus Christ's time. The people who were putting together the books of Scripture each took out references. Took references away to different things, and each time it was less relying on, like the first time it was, they took out direct references of Jesus Christ, and the second time, well, it's kind of hard to take him out when he came and he died on the cross and reappeared, and if you're putting together the New Testament, that you kind of skip the main show. So they just still keep on with trying to have as minimal in there as possible. That's just weird. I guess it must be that mindset of, for some reason, or a bias towards what they prefer. As Jonah Barnes pointed out, dear old St. Nicholas went across the room and slapped a man for suggesting that, well, maybe there's not a Trinity. So that bias can be very strong. Anyway, all right. Chapter 3, Redeeming Eve. We do not doubt our mother knew it. Aw. That's from Alma 5648. Kinda. All right. The TLDR, the Too Long Don't Read section. The brass plates contained a clear vision of Eve as a wise, strong, co-creator. This vision was inherited by both the Book of Mormon and many apocryphal books. Women are awesome, marriage is ordained of God, children are a blessing, and the joy of families was always the plan. Yes. Once we've established who the enemy really is, we can stop blaming the wrong people. Like Eve. To be fair, we're not the worst. But members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints might not appreciate just how hard the rest of the world is on Eve. That's true. I get a sense of it, but I don't understand the depth of it culturally. Most Abrahamic religions treat her quite harshly because they blame her for the fall, and they hate the fall. They regret the fall, so they despise Eve. Yeah? Heck, even if we did blame Eve for the fall, we don't hate the fall. We're pro-Eve, and we're also pro-fall. Because, as Elder Bruce R. McConkie said, the fall is the father of the atonement. See The Three Pillars of Eternity, a BYU devotional, for that quote. I think I've gotten over the worst part of my cold, but I still have a dry cough, so sorry about that. We have a fundamentally positive view of the fall because of our understanding of it comes from the Book of Mormon. And the Book of Mormon's doctrine of the atonement of Jesus Christ is sprung from a completely different root than the rest of Christianity. For the restored gospel, the fall leads to everything joyful, including the family, a doctrine for which the church is famous. Having read the brass plates, Lehi places progeny at center stage. Adam fell that men might be, and men are, that they might have joy. 2 Nephi 2:25. The rest of the Book of Mormon is obsessed with posterity and family, because the brass plates depicted a positive view of Eve, women, marriage, children, and the fortunate fall from our first parents. Blame Eve. The Old Testament doesn't really give us a lot to work with. As Professor George W. E. Nicholsberg of the University of Iowa rightly pointed out, quote, if one accepts the first chapters of Genesis and a few major references in Romans, 1 Corinthians, and the pastoral epistles, one finds almost no other mention of Adam and Eve in the entire Bible. This absence is striking given the prominence of these figures in later Jewish and Christian writings. That is interesting. There is a footnote that I'm trying to see where I missed. The rest of the Book of Mormon is obsessed with posterity and family. See 1 Nephi 8:37, Jacob 3:7, Mosiah 4:14 through 15, and a few others. But perhaps the most family-oriented theme of the Book of Mormon is visible in Nephi's, Jacob's, and Enos's frequently exhorting, instructing, and shepherding their posterity. Nephi goes so far as to mentally prioritize family as the reason for the Messiah's mission. We talk of Christ, that our children may know what source they may look for remission of their sins. 2 Nephi 25 through 26, emphasis added. The emphasis is on that our children may know. Which is true. And anyways, that was the other quote there. Okay. Dr. Blake Ostler agrees, saying, there simply is no pre-exilic interpretation of the fall of Adam. The traditional canon left the question unanswered for centuries before early Christians forced to plow forward in the dark. It's almost as if Adam and Eve's absence from the Old Testament is a mistake, which the Book of Mormon sets out to fix. See also Joseph Smith's Jr. use of the creation and fall story in his temple ceremony. Yes. The mother of all living gets a paltry 2 mentions in the entire New Testament, both by Paul. One of them is warning not to be beguiled like Eve was, while the other is famous, let the women learn in silence, in which Eve is used as justification for hushing female parishioners. So the New Testament takeaway is, don't be gullible like Eve, and Eve is why women should shut up at church. Yeah. Oof. Maybe the Old Testament silence wasn't so bad? The Old Testament's ambivalence and the New Testament's reprimand set a foundation for a chauvinistic quicksand for the early Christian fathers. Tertullian, the founder of Western theology and the father of Latin Christianity, has some strong opinions on women. His opinions are all based on the Eve story in Genesis. In his book On the Apparel of Women, this foundational Christian theologian berates women as, quote, the devil's gateway. You are the unsealer of that forbidden tree. You are the first deserter of the divine law. You are she who persuaded him whom the devil was not valiant enough to attack. You destroyed so easily God's image, man. On account of your desertion, that is, death, even the Son of God had to die. Apparel 1:1-2. Whoa, whoa, whoa! Simmer down, Tertullian. Did some girl hurt you or something? To think, and to think Tertullian was married. Hopefully his wife was illiterate. Whew! How'd the dinner conversation go after he published this? So, honey, I'm the source of all death and evil in the world, huh? Is this because I hung your heart-covered boxes out on the clothesline again? She probably flushed the toilet each time Tertullian took a shower. One can only hope. Heart-covered boxers. Sorry, not boxes. Tertullian derives this anti-woman nonsense from the fall story in Genesis. Because of Eve's beguiling, every woman must now expiate that which she derives from Eve, the ignominy, and I mean the first sin, and the odium attaching her to the cause of human perdition. The Jewish Genesis Rabbah, a Midrash text from around 400 AD, has some harsh words for our first mother. Quote, why does man go out bareheaded while a woman goes out with her head covered? She is like one who has done wrong and is ashamed of people. Therefore, she goes out with her head covered. Why do they, the women, walk in front of the corpse at the funeral? Because they brought death into the world. They therefore walk in front of the corpse. Genesis Rabbah 17:8. There is even some debate about women having souls. What? Catholics today are very keen to dispel the rumor that they once were unsure whether or not women had souls. Catholics contended that the real debate was over whether or not Genesis was including Eve in the language describing the creation of man. See Michael Nolan's The Myth of Soulless Women, First Things, Institute on Religion, Public Life, April 1997. I.e., if God imbued Adam with a soul, did that include Eve? Don't worry. They assure us we actually do think women have souls. What a relief. Have they made a decision on redheads yet? St. Jerome condemned the whole sex, quote, Thus it must be bad to touch a woman. If indulgences is nonetheless granted to the marital act, this is only to avoid something worse. But what value can be recognized in a good that is allowed only with the view of preventing something worse? Against Jovinianus 1:7. Jeez. Noted gynophile and fellow St. Paul in against Jovinianus 1:7, noted gynophile and fellow St. Paul in 1 Corinthians 7:9. Jeez Louise. For Jerome, women, marriage, and children are temporary vices. He repeats Paul, it is better to marry than to burn. That's the footnote that I just read. It should be noted that this cheery character, St. Jerome, is the single most influential biblical translator in history. He was beatified in 1747 as the patron saint of translators. See Jane Kemp in St. Jerome, patron saint of librarians, Luther College Library and Informative Services. Archived from the original on April 17, 2024. For translating the Bible into Latin, narrowly missing out on the title patron saint of incels. Just a few hundred years. Ouch. Think of the damage this did. These patristic fathers would later inherit the Roman Empire and spread their misogyny throughout the entire Western world. Jacob Boehme, a 16th century Christian theologian and philosopher, described the fall as the horrible, lamentable, and miserable fall of Adam and Eve. William T. Bruner, a Baptist theologian, writes that the most religious, especially creedal Christianity, believe and express the idea that there was nothing fortunate about the fall of man. It was a total tragedy for God and man. Whew, that comes from Why Our Belief in a Fortunate Fall Can Help Us When Questions of Faith Arise. LDS Living Magazine, September 5th, 2020. William T. Bruner, a Baptist theologian, writes that most religions, especially creedal Christianity, believe and express the idea that there was already did that one. His book is titled Children of the Devil, and yes, he is available to babysit. He only charges $6.60 per hour. Imagine looking at your birth certificate and saying, "This is a total tragedy for God and man." Creedalist Christianity does not have the brass plates, so it gets blown to and fro by weird winds. As Susan Wemple writes, theories about the inferior condition of woman, whether called from Genesis or found in the Roman tradition, enabled Latin fathers to accept the legal subordination of women, to justify sexual dimorphism in social and religious tasks. Footnote for this, Wemple, page 23. The polar opposite of historic Western chauvinism is the modern ordained women movement, which seeks to pressure the LDS Church into ordaining women to the all-male priesthood. The ambition driving this action thrives in the void left by traditional canon, the absence of the detailed explanation of woman's glorious role. As we will see, the Apocrypha agree with the Book of Mormon and that women don't need a contrived duty in God's plan because they already have one, and it's central to all creation. In other words, the canon led women to second-class citizenship. A straight line can be drawn from Genesis to Eve to women's historic oppression in the Western world. Sorry. The West's founding document begins with a woman screwing everything up. I remember my sister telling me that, she was saying that Grandma Allen didn't believe in taking pain medication on periods because that was a result of the fall, and that we should just accept it as part of our genealogical punishment. Now, I don't know if that interaction with Grandma Allen was true or not. I mean, I can see our great senior generation having holdover notions like that. It's like I generally don't like taking medication as much as possible, simply because in most cases, if my general body can become stronger by fighting illnesses as naturally as possible, the better. Like for this cold, the only thing I've been taking is the generic equivalent of Zicam, which literally on the bottle it says, hey, this is homeopathic, so, who knows if this actually works? It hasn't been assessed. And it's like, okay, well, I don't know. I tend to think that the zinc kind of stuff helps maybe just a little. And even if it is a placebo or homeopathic or whatever, it's like, yeah, I'd rather do that than ruin the lining of my stomach with harder drugs. But it's kind of interesting that I wonder if this is also a, hey, you should deal with the pain because that would also make you more fertile, because I will multiply your sorrow and your conception. So I'm wondering if there's something to that. I know there is a big debate among, and who knows about how dubious or undubious the sources are when it comes to, when you get in the, early parentage groups where people are having children for the first time, and especially focusing on fertility and stuff. there's a lot of things that cycle around there, like rumors and ideas. And so I wouldn't be surprised if some of them are like, hey, if you do anything to reduce the pain and suffering that you have on your periods, then the less God will bless you with being able to conceive. I would not be surprised if there are people who believe along those lines. And yet there is also a lot of, when it comes to pharmaceutical companies, that, people being on birth control pills, the kind that make it so you can't conceive because your hormones are tricked into believing that you're pregnant already. But then when you go off of them, they have problems later on. That's the stuff that I worry about for the future of my children. Other ones that are like in vitro, the IEDs, I think they're called, the ones where they have a thin, small physical object that is implanted that directs hormones directly into the uterine wall. That causing all sorts of issues. Who knows about that kind of stuff? How much of it is rumor? How much of it is true? There's some things where it's like, how much do you want to mess with your own natural processes? There's different types of family planning you can do. The least intrusive, the least that you can do that messes with your body's natural rhythms, the better. But it's fascinating to me that, he's right. Jonah Barnes is laying it out very strongly how strongly, culturally, men have hated Eve. And it makes me wonder how much the generic population absorbed that culture of disdain for women. Because there's a difference between the preacher and the pew in a lot of churches. And it's because, the preacher, they may have gone to some sort of seminary, gotten some sort of doctorate in this or that, or learned to study up on all this stuff, or especially during the illiterate times of, most of humanity, the preachers could read and had access to the scriptures, whereas people in the pew could only listen to what the preacher had to say. I guess it depends on their confidence of the preacher. Nowadays, we have a culture where people can think for themselves because of the literacy rate. They can access the scripture themselves. Plus, they have allowed the influence of outside things. I look at the Church of England now and how, I wouldn't say it's in shambles, but it's depicted like that in, the videos and TV and stuff that comes from the BBC. It shows like church attendance in England not being very high. So it just makes me sit there and consider, how much in the past and how many times did women just go, psh, whatever, and make their husband go, psh, whatever, because they knew that, okay, yeah, this sucks, and sure, that may have been, but we're here now, and this is how we're running our life together. Or how many of them go, no, yeah, I get it, it's true. My miserable lot in life is just because I'm a woman, and I have to accept that, and that would be, that's an interesting thought I've never thought of. And something more to consider is, if everything hit the fan again, if you had a collapse of civilization, where the people who survive are those who can make enough food in an agrarian society to survive. Like, let's say big cities, everyone starves, everyone dies. What would return in our natural order after all this time? I think it would be deplorable. I think if there were any major inner city societies that were not conservative in their values, that the role of women would become almost like cattle. That only those people who actually do have a genuine respect for women in a conservative type of way, and a strong belief in family values. I would hope that would be a lot more common in rural communities, just because of, demographics and conservative type views. And I'm not talking about like politics. I'm talking about like conservative as in they conserve the traditional family values kind of stuff. Would probably be a lot more safe of a place. Anyway, it's a good book when you keep thinking. What do brass plates teach? All this pinched-faced woman-hating is in stark contrast to what we find in the books that draw from the brass plates. In the Greek Life of Adam and Eve, when God pronounces the curses on the crew, he treats Adam and Eve much differently than he treats Satan. To Adam and Eve, the Lord merely saith to them, and the Lord turned to Eve and said, and that's what he says, the Lord saith to them, the Lord is telling Adam and Eve their consequences matter-of-factly, almost like a doctor describing the effects of treatment to a patient. Thorns and thistles shall spring up, thou shalt be in the throes of travail, you'll have a little nausea, that's natural, etc. But then the Lord turned to the serpent in great wrath and pronounced the serpent's curse. With Satan, the Lord is enacting the curse himself. I will put enmity between thee and his seed. This isn't some natural side effect that comes from the territory. It is the Lord rolling up his own sleeves. The Egyptian life of Adam and Eve also makes the word of God the implementer of the curse. I made you sick and made you to go on your belly. I made you slick and I made you to go on your belly. Oh, interesting. God's wrath is reserved for the serpent alone. Then all the beasts paid homage to Adam, according to the commandment of God, except the serpent, against which God was angry. The book of Jubilees mentioned all the three perpetrators, Adam, Eve, and Satan, but only Satan gets cursed. Interesting. All right, here's the footnotes. For the Greek Life 623:1, the Greek account also makes a distinction between God dealing with Adam, but the Lord dealing with Eve and the serpent. The angels hesitate to carry out the Lord's command, but eventually declare, "Thou art just, O Lord." Verses 27. The language is very deliberate, as if God was delegating to and training the Lord. As we would see, that it was Jehovah becoming representative of God and everything in the Old Testament. And let's see, the other one that he brings up is Jubilees tells a story in a different order. God is wroth with Eve, 3:24, but only the serpent gets cursed. Interesting. And it's always been fascinating to me about the enmity between them. It makes me feel that if we knew Satan directly, that we would just hate him, that he would be distasteful. I think that's the reason he covers his own tracks as much as possible. Anyways, next quote. I cursed ignorance, but what I had blessed previously, those I did not curse. Let me reread that again. I cursed ignorance, but what I had blessed previously, those I did not curse. I cursed not man, nor the earth, nor other creatures, but man's evil fruit and his works. 2 Enoch 31:6. These texts show that God's wrath was reserved for Satan, not childbearing women. Satan was no doubt happy to guide the scribe's fingers to pin blame on anything other than himself, e.g. filthy children, pointless work, or bumbling Eve. But these texts, and therefore the brass plates from which they and the Book of Mormon draw their teaching, exonerate the first mother. In fact, they portray her as a wise, selfless creator. Who are Adam? In Lehi's magnificent parting sermon directed at his son Jacob, he hints that the brass plates had a different version of the fall story. He reminds everyone that he is preaching according to the things which I have read, and according to that which is written. And then he subtly undermines the chauvinist narrative of the Old Testament with an alternate version of Genesis. Drawing from the brass plates, Lehi writes, Quote, "And now, my sons, I speak unto you these things for your profit, and for learning. For there is a God, and he hath created all things, to bring about his eternal purposes in the end of man, after he created our first parents, and the beasts of the field, and the fowls of the air." 2 Nephi 2:14-15. Firstly, Lehi uses the phrase, "our first parents," which is not a phrase that appears anywhere in the Bible. On the brass plates, God doesn't just create man and woman. He creates a father and a mother, a couple. Parents mean parentage. Procreation and family are implied from the very start. This fits much more neatly with the command to replenish the earth. Man and woman were man and Adam and Eve's form. Our first parents were Adam and Eve's calling. Man and woman is just what they were. Parents is what they were there to do. Lehi refers to Adam and Eve as a pair, which is something nearly lost in the English translation of the Old Testament. Genesis 1 treats them separately. Male and female created he them. But in Genesis 5, after the drama is finished, God uses the word Adam to refer to both male and female created he them, and blessed them, and called their name Adam, in the day when they were created. Genesis 5:2 emphasis added. In Hebrew, the word Adam, ADM, Adam could refer to Adam the individual or Adam the couple, not unlike a woman being called after her husband today, e.g., Mr. and Mrs. Robert Sanderson. In ancient Hebrew, Adam literally means man, as in mankind, which obviously includes women. Joseph Smith Jr. translated some word or phrase on the golden plates into the title of Our First Parents, which is used again and again in the Book of Mormon, but never in the Bible. Jacob says that Satan beguiled our first parents. Alma uses the same brass plates language. The Lord sent out our first parents forth from the Garden of Eden. Ye see by this that our first parents were cut off. Even Zeezrom calls them our first parents when arguing with Alma the Younger. Whatever reformed Egyptian words the Nephites were using, Adam came through in the Book of Mormon again and again as a pair. The Armenian history of the expulsion of Adam and Eve also refers to Adam in the plural. In conjugating the old Armenian verbs, the author always conjugates Adam's verbs as plural, like Adam are hungry, or Adam were going, for example. For English readers, the translator didn't know what to do, so he just added and Eve whenever the verse mentioned Adam. Like the Armenians, and the Nephites referred to Adam and Eve as an inseparable pair since the beginning. The second thing Lehi does is very subtle. He recites the creation story in a single verse. Quote, "And to bring about his eternal purposes in the end of man, after he had created our first parents, and the beasts of the field, and the fowls of the air, and, in fine, all things which are created, it must needs be that there was an opposition, even the forbidden fruit to in opposition to the tree of life, the one being sweet, and the other bitter." 2 Nephi 2:15. Notice the order he puts things in. 1. God's eternal purposes. 2. Creation of our first parents. 3. Creation of the beasts of the field and fowls of the air. Lehi puts Adam and Eve's creation ahead of the fauna. Instead of missing it all, Eve was there. She isn't just a decoration put on top. She's far, far more. Lehi isn't the only one hinting that Eve was present for creation. The Book of Abraham describes Eve being created before the beasts too. The Book of Moses, however, apparently based off the King James Genesis, does not. Lehi and Abraham resequence the creation events to put Eve before the fauna. There is a table here. First column is King James Version Genesis. You have creation of Adam, naming of the fauna, creation of Eve. Book of Moses, creation of Adam, naming of the fauna, creation of Eve. Lehi's Genesis, the creation of our first parents, and the naming of fauna. Book of Abraham, creation of Adam, the creation of Eve, the naming of fauna. The Book of Abraham, another extra-biblical apocryphal document, agrees with Lehi's reading of the brass plates creation story. It appears that the Book of Abraham and the brass plates both drew from the same pre-scribal tradition. This would make them literary cousins. The Book of Abraham isn't messing around either. It takes on Genesis directly. Compare the two corresponding verses, Genesis 2. And Adam gave names to all cattle and to the fowl of the air and every beast of the field. But for Adam there was not found an helpmeet for him. In Abraham 5, and Adam gave names to all the cattle and the fowl of the air and every beast of the field. And for Adam there was found an helpmeet for him. Here, while Adam is naming the fauna, he has his wife by his side. Genesis is at odds. Something has been altered. On the one hand, we have Joseph Smith Jr., Lehi, and Abraham. On the other, we have traditional Genesis. Now, to consult the Apocrypha. The Book of the Cave of Treasures corroborates Lehi by saying Eve was created on the sixth day with Adam, and only then, quote, all the wild beasts and all the cattle and feathered fowl were gathered together, and they passed before Adam, and he assigned the names to them. And they bowed their heads before him, and to everything in nature worshipped him, and submitted themselves unto him. The Divine Discourse on Abaton, a 4th century document, also mentions Eve's creation before the naming of the fauna. When Adam woke up out of his sleep, he saw her, and he said, This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of her male. Now this was Adam who gave names to all the cattle and to wild beasts. Discourse 241. So Lehi isn't alone in saying Eve was already present for the naming of the beasts. Lehi knew the importance of creation and naming. So did the author of the Book of Abraham. They would not lightly have deviated from the received sacred account of creation. Yet, if they were reading from a source like these, their chronology would be unexceptional. What's in a name? Interesting. What's fascinating to me is out of small passages and how we view those passages, we get entire cultural shifts. Like, he's right. Jonah is right. Because of the Church of Jesus Christ lens that I view things through, I always have a general, generic respect for women. I understand cognitively how other churches are pretty hard on Eve. I believe that's softened because of culture influencing churches modernly, but at the same time, when you get down to brass tacks, the people who actually study the scriptures, the ones who are like, well, I go to seminary, I think they still perceive to that idea that, hey, if Eve didn't screw up, things wouldn't be so bad. So it makes me wonder about the organization of, well, should she be there first before naming the fauna or after? How much of a big impact would that have? It shows, I think the point of Jonah showing these is that Eve is more important than we perceive. It's showing one more notch to elevate Eve in this system. What I find interesting is, when I think about the actions of both women and men nowadays, and compared to what it may have been like during pioneer time, I can only guess. I always think of and hope for those women who are strong and, willing to roll up their sleeves, go get the water, go milk the cows, go bake bread in a hot prairie, single room log cabin for their family all day. And, it was tough work. You had to have tough women, and you had to have women who were able to do all that, but also in many ways be still feminine, right? At least that's how it's depicted on Little House on the Prairie. But in the end, it's hard work. And you would want someone who could roll up their sleeves and get to it. But yet there's this culture of women trying to be dainty and the fairer sex and oh, I'm going to faint at the sight of a spider. I'm wondering if there's just cultural differences between city and rural, between frontiers women and debutantes in the city, if there's also a different treatment of them. There's just, that is something that's very much able to be explored, because it's never going to be uniform. Just as you would have women nowadays who are just grinding, henpecking nags of a woman. There are plenty of examples of that, like depicted in the Twilight Zone. Like the guy who broke his glasses after the apocalypse, that one. His wife depicted in that episode is just an absolute harpy. And I'm certain that there were women who were out there like that, who just viewed their men as weak-willed jellyfish and beat them into submission. And it's just like, yee! And that there would be very much chauvinist and abusive men, because it may have been more permitted, quite frankly. And so it makes me wonder, how many people in the majority were among any of those extremes? Or was it more along the lines of what we have now, where most people who are married just have an actual good, decent marriage? Nothing different that's terrible or special, other than you work together. You compromise, you disagree, you have arguments, you get over it, you work on it, that they're regular. It's interesting. I wonder. The only problem is I'm culturally not in these places to verify. And those who would be able to write about the culture could obviously be skewed. Just like when you get people who are the red pill and black pill videos on YouTube that are like, oh, these women are terrible. And then all these other ones that are, no, women aren't terrible, but you have to avoid these trollops on this side, or, whatever. It's skewed according to their experience. Interesting. What's in a name? This will be the last section I read for today. In the ancient world, naming was the polishing act of creation. From the first words in Genesis, we see the cosmic power of naming. Notice the pattern that God follows in the creation of the world. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw the light, and it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And the evening and the morning were the first day. And God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament, and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament, and it was so. And God called the firmament heaven. And the evening and the morning were the second day. And God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together in one place, and let the dry land appear, and it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called the seas. And God saw that it was good. Genesis 1, 3-10. A few things are going on here. 1, God is telling someone what to make. 2, it's getting made. And 3, God gives the creation's names. The Hebrew word, transliterated into Latin characters, kara, Q-A-R-A, or to call, is the linguistic center of the creation story. Later in Genesis, that same verb, kara, will be used when the newborns are named. Some examples: Genesis 1:5, God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Genesis 4:25, and he called Seth, his name Seth. And Genesis 5:29, now he called his name Noah. Genesis 16:11, and you shall call his name Ishmael. So when our first parents give names to the fauna, they are using the same verb God uses in the creation of the world, and the same verb they and their descendants would later use to name children. Savina Tubal, prolific author on Jewish history and traditions, understands the power of naming. Quote, in the biblical world, nothing exists unless it is named. The power of naming is linked to the power of creating. While the Greeks gave us our notions of hypotheticals and unspecified abstractions, the Hebrews knew that without a name, a thing simply wasn't. Hints of this still exist in the Bible. The author of the book of Ruth calls Rachel and Leah, the mothers of Israel who did build the house of Israel, because though their handmaids birthed most of the children, Rachel and Leah gave the children their names. Ooh. In this case, the naming was even more important than the physical act of giving birth. Genesis 30, verses 5 and 6. And Bilhah conceived and bare Jacob a son. And Rachel said, God hath judged me, and he hath also heard my voice, and hath given me a son. Therefore she called his name Dan. Also verses 7 and 8. And Bilhah, Rachel's maid, conceived again, and bare Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, with great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed. And she called his name Naphtali. Leah strikes back in verses 11 through 13. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a son. And Leah said, a troop cometh. And she called his name Gad. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a second son. And Leah said, happy am I, for the daughters will call me blessed. And she called his name Asher. Wow. That is interesting. And that's why my wife prevailed in naming my son, because I couldn't think of anything better. And her continually calling him Hunter stuck. Huh. So naming is even more important than actually birthing a child. Huh. In this case, naming was even more important than the physical act of giving birth. There we are. The Quran maintains that God taught Adam the names of all things. Once Adam was trained on the names, God tested him. O Adam, inform them of their names. In Genesis, God brings the fauna unto Adam to see what he would call them. The apocryphal Discourse on Abaton adds that Adam was operating under God's supervision. Unto all of them did Adam give names, according to the command of my God, my good Father. There is a sacred creative power to naming which God was having Adam exercise. In Genesis, God keeps training Adam by bringing Eve to him and supervising as Adam pronounces upon her a name. When God wants to strip Satan of his power after the divine rebellion, he has to strip the devil of his ability to name. Satan's sympathizers see this as too much. Quote, removing the writing which is in the hand of the proud one, he is the head over them, and their names are written in his hand. Thus it is with this cunning one, and the names of the angels were written in his hand. And all the angels gathered together to him, and they did not wish to remove the writing from his hand. That's Apocryphal Discourse 2-3. Interesting. The power of naming stays prominent in the Hebrew Bible. Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph are given their names immediately after their birth by their mothers. These women don't just name them, but give explanations as to how the name has future implication for the role and life of the child. Hebrew custom stated that the creation needed a name in order to become fully sentient. As Tubal declares, naming then belongs to the same act of creation as giving birth, and the naming of a child has a gravity similar to God's creation of the universe. Historically, and to this day, many cultures never name a stillborn child. To be named is to live, and to live is to be named. The Gnostics also tried naming to creation, or more precisely, recreation, when adherents were acting out their exaltation in the book of Jehu. Progressing through the ranks of the veils was always operative upon giving or receiving the great name or saying his name 3 times, or acquiring a name for one's self. The veils that divide the states of existence are parted with sacred names. This is Jehu 40, line 25. In the moment that you say his name in these words and this mystery, and you turn yourselves to the 4 corners of the treasury, or when you are in the place in which you are, then the watchers of the gates and the ranks of the treasuries and their veils, which are drawn before these fathers, will all be drawn back from within to without of them all, from first to last of them all. Weird sentencing structure, but I get it, it's translated. So, these stories imply that the names somehow existed prior to their utterance. Notice that John, son of Zechariah and son of Jesus, and Jesus, son of Mary, have names already set apart for them. Really? Even though we do not have a record of Mary Mother's getting help with her name, Mary's mortal name is revealed to Alma a century before her birth. The Ethiopian eunuch reveals that Noah's name was preset too. Footnote time. Luke 1:13, but the angel said unto him, Fear not, Zacharias, for thy prayer is heard, and thy wife Elizabeth shall bear thee a son, and thou shalt call his name John, in Matthew 1:20-21. But while he thought on these things, behold, the angel of the Lord appeared unto him in a dream, saying, Joseph, thou art the son of David, fear not to take unto thee Mary thy wife, for that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Ghost, and she shall bring forth a son, and thou shalt call his name Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins. Alma 7:9-10. But behold, the Spirit hath said this much unto me, and behold, he shall be born of Mary. And 1 Enoch 106:3. And I, Enoch, answered and said unto them, This son who has been born unto you shall be left on the earth, and his 3 children shall be saved with him, when all mankind that are on the earth shall die, and his sons shall be saved. And now make known unto thy son Lamech, that he who has been born is in truth his son, and call his name Noah, for he shall be left to you, and he and his sons shall be saved from the destruction, which other names were foreordained, but the records of them were lost. Question mark. That is interesting. Our parents naming creatures at their whim. The father is commanding the names to the first couple, or he simply taught them ahead of time. God is invoking and training our first parents to be creators with himself, like a mother walking her daughter through a family recipe. Sacred names are something foreordained, and God is passing on their generative power to the next generation, including his first daughter, the first mother Eve. This doesn't make a lot of sense if all you have is Genesis. But Lehi had a different creation story on his brass plates. If he had access to something like the Book of Moses, Lehi would have read about the 2 stages of creation, a spiritual creation and a natural one. For I, the Lord God, created all things, of which I have spoken spiritually, before they were naturally upon the face of the earth. Parallel to when God animated Adam's body, made from clay, our first parents animated the bodies of the fauna. This gives mankind power over the beasts, since their naming enthrones the name giver in authority over the name bearer. Notice how the account of the Book of the Cave of Treasures ties names to dominion. Adam assigned names to them, and they bowed their heads before him, and everything in nature worshipped him and submitted themselves unto him. Creators have power over their creations, and name givers are creators. What does this mean for Eve? Everything. It doesn't take a marriage counselor to know that without a woman, man won't get very far trying to create on his own. Yet somehow the Cretists managed to convince themselves that the world was created without a woman. That'd be a miracle, considering that nothing else ever was in the history of forever. The canon quietly disposes of Eve by shrouding the naming ritual. As the birth of Jacob and Esau, the text simply states, "He was named Jacob, and they called his name Esau." Who called him? Who's they? Was his birth accompanied by, I don't know, his mother? Tubal sees the ruse. The real namers, the women who do their naming as part of a continuous act of creation, have been effaced from the passive "he was named." These pages have been tweaked to remove the woman's role in naming. Just like Eve has been passively omitted from her divine role as creator with Adam. Instead of the bumbling ditz who doomed mankind because she was peckish and puckish, Eve was partner with Adam from the beginning. As a pair, our first parents called the fauna into existence. The only faint hint of this in the Bible might come from Genesis 3:19, where Adam's woman is renamed the mother of Kol Shai, the mother of all living. This sounds more like what the brass plate keeper Jacob was reading when he refers to every living creature, both men, women, and children, who belong to the family of Adam. Eve wasn't just a human with a womb. She was a goddess in embryo. Notice that Adam doesn't name her Eve because she's the mother of all men, but because she is the mother of all living. Thankfully, the brass plates don't indulge in the Eve hating. Well, in the book of in the language of Adam, Dave Butler focuses on that. He's like, it's the mother of all living, not just humankind, but all, everything, all creatures too, which is held up by the implication that if she was a co-namer with Adam, that she's the mother of everything just as well as he's the kind of like the father. Thankfully, the brass plates don't indulge in the Eve hating. Lehi says our first parents were together immediately before he mentions creating the fauna. And if women are the birthers and namers of ancient Hebrew tradition, then Lehi's short description paints a perfectly consistent picture. Adam and Eve were together, and they both used the sacred names to call creatures from their spiritual state into their mortal life. Adam couldn't create without Eve, and Adam and Eve were co-creators with God, and had dominion over the earth as a couple, which coincides with a lot of other things. Okay, this means that Eve was as much a party to Adam's dominion as Adam was. The Old Slavonic says as much explicitly. Quote, before sin, the fall, Adam was in paradise, and he had everything he wanted, and everything was subject to his will. And if Adam did not command the creatures, then neither beasts, nor birds, nor reptiles dared to walk, lie down, or eat anything until Adam showed them and allowed them so. So had Eva such power. Word, the one, emphasis added. The earth was not just made for man alone. It was made by and for men and women united in couples. The brass plates never lost this precious truth. Next is the pushy serpent. We're going to stop here, but this is interesting. Okay. Woo-hoo-hoo-hoo. There is plenty left to chapter 2. We might have to break it up into 3 sections, depending on how far I get. Because, again, good books make my mind just go off on all different places. That's interesting. Okay. So I wonder if this means that Satan was jealous. The whole Satan was jealous of Adam after the creation and naming of the animals, but after the naming of animals, but before the fall. Because it's showing that Adam and Eve, as creators, because of them having mortal bodies and being delegated the task of sharing the names of the animals with them so that they are capstone created. And here's Satan, one of the first who was organized, one of the smart ones, right? hey, I was made early. I should have this. Again, prideful and not considering his own emotions and his own issues. And flipping the table. Being angry. I can see that now when you couple the naming with power and the capstone of creation. Now I understand why he was talking about that the women were the ones who named things. And to me, it's I'm trying to figure out how much there's. You can throw around. Sorry, I keep stumbling over my words because here's what I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of how women are depicted, how women act, how they are shown on things like YouTube. And I'm trying to figure out, because obviously, you have it on video, how some of these women are just vapid. They are absolutely just unaware of themselves and the world, and they sell themselves physically very low and have morals of an alley cat. And at the same time, you have other women who are depicted as being pushy and monstrous and terrible. But yet the majority of women that you meet in real life are just good, regular, normal people, right? So it's entertainment to put the extremes in purview of everyone. But my question becomes then, how much of certain traits are very natural to women compared to what their divine destiny can and should and ought to be? Because I think of a divine woman as someone who is wise, someone who is a creator, a mother, a nurturer, as someone who helps with the education of their children, someone who helps give them encouragement and direction. Whereas, like, if dad is like what's the natural order of it? Like, if women are these nurturers, are men the justice part of things? They're like, all right, kid, yeah, you scraped your knee, rub some dirt in it, and let's walk around on it. Come on, because it is amazing how often men fit a very specific types of patterns. And you're like, okay, if I were a guy in this same cycle of patterns, I wouldn't be that much different. Oh, these guys, they don't know where anything is. That's because the wife keeps cleaning things up and moving things. We have great object permanence. And when it's not exactly where we put it last because it got picked up and moved, there's a reason we can't find our keys. Because it went from where we stuck it to where it's supposed to be. So there's so much that is hilarious, because guys really fall into tropes and stereotypes very easily. And you're like, yeah, I get it. And I'm sitting here going, but is there much of a universal trope for women? There seems to be like many of them. Everything from ditzy and vapid to calculating and manipulative to being overbearing and henpecking. There's just not kind of like this general channel. Men are often depicted for humorous sake. They're just idiots. But it's like, no, we have no problem bearing with the conceptualization of that, because we will forbear for the sake of those who would love to presume such. Men are quite intelligent, even when they're depicted as being idiots. They know what's going on. But besides some ill-gotten tropes that are on either side, it's just one of those things. I'm like, how much is really there or not? Anyways, I've got work to do today. This has been wonderful in examining the cultural uplift of how different passages and their perception determines how women have been treated and how women have seen themselves. And it makes me wonder, how much are we still suffering from either the initial idea of Eve being bad, 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 versus the counter argument to that of women can do no wrong, versus being level-headed because of the Book of Mormon and the apocryphal writings. It makes me, one thing this does is makes me appreciate what we have just all in the Book of Mormon. But it's, that's one main crux of this, is that it supports that, yeah, the Book of Mormon got it right. And a lot of the doctrine and how we teach things, yeah, we got it right. There are certain details that are much more fascinating. The idea of writing in the hand. He's mentioned that passage twice, that Lucifer had the writing in his hand, as if being able to name things, which is also very interesting because things with the hand and names are very fascinating to consider in a liturgical and symbolic sense. It also makes me wonder about, was he talking about that Satan had the names of his angels in his hands, basically those people who would follow him under their own, like, it's as if, we're supposed to be called Christians. We're supposed to be called by Jesus Christ's name. And if we are in his hand and we're called by his name, there is certain symbolic meaning to that. But what if Satan was trying to make his own name and have people be called by his name? And that would basically be the list of people who wanted to follow Satan, and those were his entourage that were also cast out. And that he took away the ability of naming. Well, this goes right back to me studying that Tower of Babel, where they talk about they wanted to build a tower that could reach heaven, and they wanted to make a name for themselves. This sounds like they were trying to replace Jesus Christ as the one who is the name by which you are saved. That they were trying to make a name for themselves, to have a temple dedicated to them, not to Christ. Interesting. More insight is given. Cool. Love you lots, Pa. Have a good day.